Tonight on Greater Boston, newly named interim Suffolk DA Kevin Hayden joins me on his philosophy of criminal justice. Is it the same as that of his former predecessor, Rachel Rollins? And Secretary of State Bill Galvin joins me after announcing his campaign for an historic 8th term following a challenge from Boston NAACP President Tanisha Sullivan. And then finally, you may have heard Tom Brady's retiring, but did he forget about his 20 years in New England? Boston Herald Pat's columnist Karen Guregian joins me. When Rachel Rollins was sworn in as the new U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts earlier this month, she left an empty seat at the helm of the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, which she was elected to in 2018 with more than 70% of the vote, largely on a platform of criminal justice reform. And to finish up Rollins' term, Governor Charlie Baker tapped my next guest, now interim District Attorney Kevin Hayden, who'd been heading up the state's sex offender registry board and served as assistant Suffolk County DA for more than a decade prior. DA Hayden, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. How'd you get the job? Did you reach out to the governor or did the governor reach out to you?
When I found out about the possibility that Rachel Rollins would go to the U.S. Attorney's Office and become the U.S. Attorney, I asked for the governor to consider me.
And you have said in repeated interviews, you don't know yet if you're running for re-election. Is that not just a formality? Why would you dislocate yourself and take a job for such a small amount of time rather than saying, this is what I want to do, and at the appropriate time, I'll say that I'm running for a full term?
It's highly likely that that's what will happen. I am still in the process of making some decisions. I am day to day working hard at getting up to speed here, having conversations with my family about this, and there will be a decision coming soon. Dan
Conley was your former boss when you were an assistant DA. His quote about your ascension to the role was that he believed you'd embrace a more traditional prosecutor's role. Is Conley right?
I don't think I've ever been a traditional prosecutor, even when I was working for Dan Conley. I've always cut my teeth on being a prosecutor that thought it was equally as important to be community engaged, involved in intervention and prevention strategies as it was to be involved in enforcement. So, you know, I was hired by Ralph. Dan, you reminded me at one point that I actually worked longer for him than I did for Ralph. But I don't know if conventional would be the right word.
Ralph as in Ralph Martin for people who may be new to the area. I asked your predecessor about you and what she thought of your choice, and here's what Rachel Rollins had to say.
I didn't formally give a list to the governor, but I had a very positive conversation with Mr. Hayden.
Did he speak to a commitment to continue your view that caused you to win a landslide election, your view of what criminal justice should look like in Suffolk County?
I encourage you to have him on your show and talk to him about what he'd like his administration to be. But I have been clear, Jim, the people of Suffolk County voted for 4 years of what we proposed.
She encouraged me to ask you, so I'll ask you, how much of the Rollins philosophy are you prepared to embrace, District Attorney?
So I think when you look at the overall rationales behind the philosophy, and I have had several very good conversations with U.S. Attorney Rollins, when you talk about the overview of reducing our carceral footprint, not criminalizing poverty and drug addiction, when you talk about reform and not prosecuting low-level offenses and dealing with more violent crime, those are all things that I stand behind and support. Those are things I've always stood behind and support, even when I was in the DA's office many years ago.
So when you say you would not prosecute low-level offenses, I think a lot of people misunderstood. Rollins never said, I will never prosecute them. She said, and I'll put words in her mouth, there's a rebuttable presumption that they will not be prosecuted, that instead we'll do some diversion kind of thing. Is that where you are on the more minor offenses? She listed 15 in particular.
Yes, and in addition to that, I think that accountability measures and diversions need to be continued to be fostered and built in even increasing measure. So, you know, the reality is, as I understand it, that for under Rollins' administration, about 25% of those cases were not prosecuted.
Yeah.
I think under Dan Conley, it was only about 15% more that were not prosecuted. So I don't know if there was not necessarily a huge schism there, but I do think that it's important to look at accountability measures short of prosecution. It's important to look at diversion. It's important to take into account that low-level offenses should hopefully not carry someone forward with negativity for the rest of their life.
And her Integrity Review Bureau that led to the release of a number of men, mostly black men, most of whom had served decades in jail for crimes that they absolutely did not commit or very likely did not commit. Will that continue on your watch as well?
Absolutely. We have to be willing to not only look forward into how we're handling cases, but also to be able to look back and be willing to correct errors when they're made.
So what changes will you make in this intervening 9, 10, 11 months until 10 months until there's an election, District Attorney?
Well, I think that if there are changes that are going to be made, I think it could take longer than 9, 10, or 11 months. So I don't know if the changes will be readily apparent. Nothing is changing as of right now as we look deeply into what's going on. We will be driven by best practices and be driven by the data and statistics that are out there when we make a determination as to our policy.
It seems to me that the public trust in a district attorney's office is at least in part a function of how much people trust the police with whom you work. This has been a hell of a year. There's a long-term police officer, went on to be president of the union, credibly charged with serial sexual assault. A guy who was commissioner for a day, actually for 2 days, removed from that post amidst charges of domestic violence, overtime scandals. Do you see part of your responsibility to help fix what ails the Boston Police Department?
Well, I think when I look at the Boston Police Department overall, I think that there are far more good officers and good things that are being done by the Boston Police Department than bad. I think when you look at wrongdoing, corruption, and/or even criminal activity that may have happened or alleged to have happened, that absolutely cannot stand or be tolerated. When you're in a position, and that carries through to our office too, as prosecutors, being in a position of public trust, being in a position where we have authority, we have to be held to a higher standard. We have to be willing to examine ourselves and to root out any ills or wrongdoings that may take place.
When you were working in the DA's office in your former life, one of the things you were in charge of was the Safe Neighborhoods Initiative, and I know you work with gangs. I'm sure you saw the editorial in the Globe the other day, and it's not just the editorial that talks about this gang database and the lack of transparency and accountability, drawing people in who are there purely because of the neighborhood they live in or a casual associate. Should it be reformed, eliminated, kept as is? What's your take on that?
I don't think it should be eliminated, and I don't think it can be kept as is. I think it's going to need to be carefully looked at and reformed and refined so that we know that it's not being used in any impartial way, that it's not being used in any way that's unfair or that's unfairly targeting people. But I would not want to see it go away. I think that would greatly hamper our law enforcement partners and their ability to do their job.
You know, before you go away, District Attorney, you were supposed to be here last week, and you were not here, unfortunately, because of the death of your father. I didn't know your father, but I read about him since he died. Could you spend the final minute and talk about him rather than us talking about you? He was a pretty impressive man.
Sure. I'll try not to get too emotional here, but yeah, my dad did a lot for the city of Boston, did a lot for Suffolk County, dedicated his life to public service in different arenas than I am now. But his dedication to public service is what drove me to dedicate myself to public service as well. His work ethic is embedded in me, and I take tremendous pride in that. And his pride in our community, in Black history, in our Black culture, and understanding that history in our culture, and knowing that we need to understand it in order to understand not only who we are now, but where we're going is something that was vitally important to him and is vitally important to me and my entire family. And he is the patriarch that really built that foundation.
Well, I wish I'd met him. Glad to have met you. Good luck in your job. Hope to see you a lot in the coming months.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Next up, a man who's no stranger to Massachusetts politics, having just announced he's running for an historic 8th term as Secretary of the Commonwealth, William Galvin. And in his last election cycle, things got tense, as we saw on this show with then-challenger Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim.
There's corporate
Bill,
money.
you're using this as a distraction
No,
from
I'm not.
your use of taxpayer money.
The distraction is what you're trying to do.
No.
This is a simple question. Just say yes, and we won't have any corporate money here in
Bill,
Massachusetts.
I've said if you're willing to return the taxpayer money you used to fund your campaign.
Say yes, and we won't have any corporate money in Massachusetts.
Bill,
if you don't say yes,
Bill,
then you're saying we are going to have corporate
Bill, we've
money.
continued to have this discussion.
This time around, Galvin's Democratic primary challenger, corporate attorney and president of the NAACP's Boston branch, Tanisha Sullivan, appears to be striking a different tone, as she shared with me a couple of weeks back.
First, I do want to be clear that I respect Bill Galvin. I certainly respect his 40-plus years of public service and his 27 years in the office of Secretary of State. That said, this moment, I believe, requires a fresh perspective.
Joining me now is Secretary Bill Galvin. Secretary, it's good to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be with you.
Why are you going for 8?
Because I think we're at a critical point. I'm very pleased with all the changes we've made in Massachusetts and really shown the way for the country with no excuse by mail voting, with automatic voter registration, with online voter registration. And I want to see that made permanent. But I think the bigger issue is what we're looking at in the 22 election and the 24 election. It's no secret that throughout the country there's been an effort to dial back the rights of voters with a partisan point of view. Who's going to challenge that? You know, when Donald Trump claimed that New Hampshire was stolen by people on buses in Massachusetts, I was able to stand up and call out the fraud. You have to know elections. You have to have the experience to run elections to be able to call out false claims of fraud.
Tanisha Sullivan said in her announcement, and said here a couple times, a fresh perspective. And while she wouldn't be precise, I assume what that meant is in terms of race, gender, age. We've never had a woman Secretary of State. We've never had a person of color Secretary of State. Should that not be a relevant consideration for voters?
It's up to the voters to decide what their choices are. I think the most important issue in this particular office at this particular time is the ability to administer elections. And my experience as administering elections, even before I was Secretary of State, I argued cases. You know, I was sued like 20 times in the last cycle. I'm still being sued now about some of these things. The ability to argue these cases, the understanding of how the system works, making sure with 351 cities and towns how we flawlessly get everyone to vote, which we have a great record. And that's what I want to continue doing. I think that's the most important credential, but it's up to the voters to decide what the credentials they will use.
The Senate has passed a voting reform bill making permanent some of the changes during COVID-19. The House passed a fairly similar bill. The House left out same-day voter registration.
Right.
Sent it to you for a study. What was your reaction to that move?
Well, it was a distraction. The idea was to have a reason. It was a parliamentary maneuver to prevent a vote on the actual issue. There's no reason for a study. I support Election Day registration. I think most people understand it would be helpful to us at this point. I think it would complete all of the issues that we want to raise. I'm still optimistic we might be able to get it.
Is it a reflection on your advocacy? You're the chief elections person. You're the expert on election stuff. Couldn't make it through the House. Why doesn't that reflect on you?
Because it doesn't, because the House is choosing to vote based upon their own criteria, which is what affects them personally, politically. And that point was made by a number of the people who engaged in the debate. Representative Gouveia publicly said it was incumbent protection. I'd previously said some of the other actions they've taken this year in the redistricting cycle of that. It had nothing to do with me. They knew where I stood. I'm for Election Day registration.
Let's speak for a second about larger election reform issues. Here's what candidate Sullivan had to say to me a couple of weeks ago about the state of affairs.
We have an idea that here in Massachusetts, everything is okay. And the reality is that, you know, whether we're talking about mail-in balloting, same-day voter registration, full implementation of ERIC, the electronic registration information system here in Massachusetts, we are actually behind other states. So first and foremost, we got to catch up.
Do we have to catch up, Bill Galvin?
No, absolutely not. That's simply untrue. We have vote by mail. We want to make sure it's permanent. We ran a vote by mail situation in 3 elections in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic with record turnouts in all 3. We had absolute transparency in the counting. No one quarreled with it, so we have that. As far as the other issues, that we have automatic voter registration. We have ease of registration throughout the state. You can register not only in person, but you can do it online. What she said is simply untrue. As far as ERIC is concerned, that's a list maintenance process, which we have already indicated our willingness to join. In order to do it during the pandemic, you had to do a mailing. There was a concern about that. We've already agreed we're going to do it. It has no real relevance to voters in Massachusetts.
Let's talk about one thing we don't have is a voter-friendly public record laws. We are the only state, as far as I understand, where the judiciary, the legislature, and the governor's office claims an exemption from public records laws. You oversee public records laws. Today,
I enforce the law.
You enforce the law. Today, from what I understand, today, or maybe yesterday, you filed a bill through Senator Eldridge to make sure that at least some documents, emails in the governor's office would be accessible to the public through a public records law. If that's a good idea, why wasn't it a good idea in your first, second, third, or fourth term?
I already did.
And
I proposed an initiative several years ago, an initiative petition. We didn't get enough signatures. I was intimately involved in the redrawing of the public records law in 2016 with the late Representative Kokot. The reality is we already have a stronger public records law because of what I did. The entrenched resistance of the governor, let me speak to the governor for a minute. Every governor since Bill Weld has taken advantage of a very bad decision.
1997.
Yeah, the Lambert case, which was about judicial nominees, to claim, and it didn't matter whether they were Democrats or Republicans, they were not going to give up their records. They were exempt. What I proposed through Senator Eldridge is now that we're having a change in the governor's office in January, I can't fight the battle for the past. I'd rather fight the battle we might be able to win for the future. And I'm saying as of the day the new governor takes office, every record should be public. And I think this should be an issue in the governor's race. We should hear now from all the prospective governors that they're willing to do this. As far as the legislature is concerned, you know, they're obviously entrenched in this issue. Several of their own members have tried to change it unsuccessfully. Again, the judiciary similarly regards itself as exempt. We have had a breakthrough in the enforcement of public records laws. In fact, just last week, as a result of the law that I supported and worked on, for the first time, a media outlet, in this case the Worcester Telegram, was able to claim over $100,000 in counsel fees for getting access to police records that we had said they should have had since 2003. My supervisor of public records has had more cases decided more effectively and more quickly than ever before. But it can be improved.
If I may, I don't understand, though, if you're running on your effectiveness in your job, and I know you're not the legislature secretary.
I'm not.
But the access issue that made us 50th out of 50 has been there a long time. Even when you get access, the fees that people have to pay are astronomical.
Not as much as they used to be.
Well,
we got it reduced.
But should that not be visited on you? The fact
the fact is I've been working to reduce them and effectively did reduce them several years ago. You have to understand there's a fiefdom mentality in all the bureaucracies of Massachusetts, all. And a resistance.
You used to serve in the House, by the way, I should say, for those who do not know.
But I think that's why I think I can diagnose what the issues are. The reality is there's a fiefdom mentality. They don't want to give up anything. There's a resistance. And you have to overcome that. And that's why the ability to go to court, the ability to get court costs and fees is extremely important in terms of helping. The only remedy I have is to refer it for enforcement to the Attorney General. And if the Attorney General, and many of them have, declined to enforce it, that's the end of it.
So you used the term fiefdom a second ago. You talked about incumbent protection earlier on. This is virtually a unanimously Democratic infrastructure. All the constitutional officers, virtually every legislator, except for the governor. So shouldn't someone like you who thinks the legislature isn't doing its job support a Republican governor going forward? I'm serious about this. Going forward so that there at least is some balance rather than a fiefdom?
I have supported Republican governors in their policies when in point of fact, and I've worked closely with Republican governors.
How about on election day?
Well, I'm a Democrat. I prefer to vote for a Democrat if I can. And I think most citizens are like that. They want to vote for the person they're most comfortable with. I believe most of the Democratic candidates, I've worked with Democratic governors and Republican governors very closely. I know one other record I hold, which is no one has been acting governor more than me because the lieutenant governors, Republican lieutenant governors used to become governor because the governor took off. And in the case of former Lieutenant Governor Murray, he left. So I've worked very closely with governors of both parties, and I think all of them would tell you I've worked honestly and effectively with them. But it's not about me working with them. It's about how we get to good public policy. So when a Republican governor has said something good, I'm going to support it. And for instance, in the case of the recent elections, we made those reforms. Governor Baker stood up and supported it. He supported the changes we made, and I thanked him for it. He thanked me for what we were able to do together.
Bill Galvin, thanks for your time. I hope we see you a lot in the months ahead.
I expect you will.
Thanks so much. Tom Brady, the consensus greatest of all time, made his retirement Instagram official this morning with an 8-page post, not including the picture of him in his Bucs uniform, talking about how he's loved his career, his current teammates, the city of Tampa, their fans, the owners, all their coaches, his personal trainer, his agents, his family. 8 Instagram pages without a single word about the 20 years he spent as a New England Patriot. It wasn't until 3 hours after his initial announcement that Brady retweeted a Robert Kraft tribute and added this: "Thank you, Patriots Nation. I'm beyond grateful. Love you all." That was it. I'm joined now by Karen Guregian, Patriots beat columnist for the Boston Herald. Karen, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Did you go to every single game that Brady played as a Patriot all 20 years?
I pretty much went to all of them except one, and it happened to be the first Super Bowl because I was headed to Salt Lake for the Olympics and couldn't quite navigate being there and being in Salt Lake at the same time. So I'm pretty sure that was the only one I missed.
So 20 years minus 1 qualifies you to answer this question. Is he not just the best football player ever? Is he the best at his job of anyone you've seen at any job over such a long period of time?
Yeah, when you put in the longevity, 22 years, age 84, I mean, he totally shattered the age myth. And, Father Time always wins, except when it comes to Tom Brady. And the fact that, in his age 40-year-old season, he led the league in touchdown passes and yards, pretty much says it all. And no one in the sport has won more games, won more Super Bowls. And the thing that gets me, and I sort of wrote about it, is, he's not like this world-class athlete, but he worked so hard at it and his work ethic. And it got to a point where, I think every time he was on the field, no matter what the team, no matter what the score, I think that team had this inner belief that they would win no matter what.
Yeah, I buy that from afar. But for a guy who elevated spontaneity on the field to an art form and then some, it seemed to me as a long, distance observer, every word he ever spoke in public was carefully crafted and intentional. And when I read, like everybody watching the show, the Instagram post this morning, and he thanked everybody from the owners to the fans, all Bucks, to the coaches, to the janitors, literally, all the staff who smiled every morning, that was an intentional omission. I know he wrote a beautiful note when he left Boston a couple of years ago. What do you make of that complete, I think, snub of 20 years here?
Well, it was definitely eyebrow raising, definitely curious. I haven't spoken to him or anyone in his camp to get exactly, if it was an intentional slight, which it appears to be. I've been inundated with mail from angry fans who are very unhappy about that. And which is their right. But I've also talked to a few of his teammates who say, you know what, just let the guy retire, get over it, So I can see both sides, but I definitely understand where the fans are coming from.
We had a lot of hostility actually on the radio today, and I think it was not just leaving town, but it was the thing from in baseball, correct me if I'm wrong, and I know you're the Patriots beat report, but in baseball, if you've played on more than one team, there's a decision about what hat or what shirt or whatever you go in under. So, like, theoretically, David Ortiz, obviously it's not going to happen. Could be a Red Sox or a Minnesota Twin. Obviously, it's going to be Red Sox. Do the same rules apply to the NFL Hall of Fame when he's admitted in 5 years? Is it possible he could be identified as a Buck, as a head of a Patriot?
I suppose. I mean, what they do is a bust, and it's a facial bust. So there's no helmet thing on there. But, I haven't, it's remiss of me. I haven't been to the Hall of Fame. So I don't know if there's something on a wall that, a picture of some sort. And perhaps that's where the uniform decision would come in. I don't know that for a fact because I haven't been to the Hall of Fame, but when you just have a bust, there's no real distinction.
That's comforting. So do you have one? I read your legacy piece today, but do you have one memory? I mean, for me, it's not one play, but obviously the 28-3 comeback in the Super Bowl, unlike anything I've ever seen in anything, not just football, my whole life. Do you have one memory from 20 years of being up close and personal with him?
Well, it was actually the Seattle comeback. Mm-hmm. And, I think he brought them, I think he scored 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter in that game. And the press box, when Malcolm Butler picked off that pass, I've never heard a press box just collectively gasp.
That's great. That's great.
But it was all, that was all part and parcel of the game itself. And again, one more Brady comeback. It looked like it was going to go for naught. And then Malcolm Butler comes up out of nowhere. And literally, I'm telling you, the same time, 100 people, hundreds of thousands of people in the press box gasped aloud, like, oh my God. So, that sticks out to me.
That's
obviously big. 28-3 sticks out to me. There's so many. The Giants game to end the season, the perfect season, him hitting Randy Moss late in that game, pulling out that game. And I have actually so much respect for the Giants for putting up a fight in that game. But, completing the perfect season. There's so many. Playing with the 20 staples in his hand and winning.
I couldn't do the show with 20 staples in my hand. Hey, can I interrupt you to just ask the question? There's a rumor around here that at every press conference, I only have 10 seconds left, he would do a hi Karen when he in the press. Is that rumor or true? And
it is true.
And what's that about?
I don't know. Maybe I was the Helen Thomas for him or something, because I was around for so long. But whenever my hand was raised and I got the microphone, there was always a warm greeting from Tom.
Great.
And then win or lose, too.
Karen, love your reporting and really happy you could give us a few minutes here tonight. Thanks so much for doing it.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe.